Having said that, let me now turn to introducing my dear friend and former colleague, Zhu Tian. We were colleagues for nearly 14 years at the China-Europe International Business School, and it was my pleasure to interact with him quite regularly. Zhu Tian was with me in India in December of 2019. He was visiting India for the first time, and he's, in my view, has one of the sharpest minds that I have ever found in an economist. And during the 1 week that we were together in India, I was able to see India in a new way through his eyes, you know, and benefit from some of his very incisive insights on India. Zhu Tian is the Santander Chair Professor of Economics at the China-Europe International Business School. He's an Associate Dean and Director of the EMBA program, which is arguably the largest EMBA program in the world, with an intake of about 800 students every year. He has been at CEIBS, the China-Europe International Business School, since 2005, prior to which he spent 10 years at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. And prior to HKUST at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, he spent some years in industry. Zhu Tian has got his bachelor's and master's degrees from Tsinghua University and Peking University. For those of you who are familiar with China, these are absolutely the two best universities in China. You could think of them as the MIT and the Harvard of China. And then he went to the United States, to Northwestern University, for his PhD in economics. Zhu Tian is very well published. He has published in many leading academic journals and also in A-list media, such as the Financial Times, Forbes, the Wall Street Journal, China Daily, Guancha, and many other outlets. Zhu Tian won the CEIBS Teaching Excellence Award also. So we are delighted to have you with us, Zhu Tian, and looking forward to listening to your presentation. Let me introduce Professor Vamsi Vakulabharanam. Professor Vamsi is Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. He's joining us from the United States now. Thank you, Vamsi, for waking up very early in the morning to be with us. Prior to joining UMass, he served for 6 years on the faculty of the University of Hyderabad. For those of you who are not familiar with this, the University of Hyderabad is one of the best universities in India. It's a central university set up by the central government of India. Prior to which he spent 3 years on the faculty of the City University of New York. He got his PhD from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and he has a bachelor's degree in computer science from the National Institute of Technology, another leading engineering school in India. His areas of research interest include political economy, economic development, inequality, and he's a specialist in Asian economics with a particular focus on China and India. So he's very well qualified to be the discussant for today's session. So the format today is going to be that Professor Zhu Tian is going to present for about 40 minutes or so, after which we will invite Professor Vamsi to offer his critique on Professor Zhu Tian's presentation, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. I request all the participants, other than the speakers, to please mute yourself so that we don't have any background disturbance. And without further ado, Zhu Tian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rama. It's a great pleasure. Thanks for your nice introduction. So Rama and I have been a long-time colleague. He's been a great colleague, great friend, and a great scholar, and also a great leader. So he was one of the academic leaders in our school, CEIBS. And also thanks to Professor Vamsi for agreeing to be the discussant. And of course, thanks to Ahan for organizing this. So my topic is the title of my book, Catching Up to America. So I tried in this book, I tried to understand the factors behind the rapid economic rise of China. So by catching up to America, I basically just mean the economic catching up. So in terms of GDP, over the past 40 some years, so China is quickly catching up to America. So basically, so the American GDP over the past 42 years has about tripled. But in the case of China, so China has experienced a 40-fold increase in its GDP. So that's basically about 9% annual growth for 42 years. So how rapid is the rise? So of course, if we compare China with other major economies, these are all developed economies. You can see that China started at a very low level 40 some years ago. China was actually the 11th largest economy in the world in 1978, behind the Netherlands. Now China, of course, is the second largest economy by current US dollars. But if we use purchasing power parity figure, then China is already the largest economy. So the question, of course, is what has driven the rapid rise of China? And now, of course, China is already the second largest economy, and the US-China relations are pretty bad these days. So can China's further rise be slowed or even reversed by the strained China-US relations in the post-COVID era? And that means we wonder about the long-term economic prospect of China. So to answer these questions, I wrote the book, which was just published last year in September. The title is Catching Up to America. The subtitle is Culture, Institutions, and the Rise of China. I tried to show the separate impact of culture and institutions in the rise of China. So so we just saw this. So China is catching up to America in terms of GDP in aggregate. Of course, China has a much faster growth rate than the US. But this fact alone shouldn't be very surprising, because we all know that China started from a very low basis. So by this, we mean the low income level measured by per capita GDP. So here I look at a 40-year period from 1979, which basically is the first year of China's economic reform, to 2019, just before the COVID outbreak. Now, so China started at a very low income level, about $300 per capita. Of course, the US started at $30,000 per capita, measured by the constant 2010 dollars. And now China's per capita GDP, so basically 40 years ago, China's income level was only at 1% of the US level. Now, China's per capita GDP currently is about 16% of the US level. So in that sense, the distance, the gap between China and the US in terms of the income level has narrowed by 16 times. Now, again, of course, it's not surprising because China started from a very low basis. So for that very reason, of course, China has grown faster than not only than the US, but also than Europe and also faster than Japan. And for that reason, and India also has grown very fast over the past 40 years. And Korea has grown also very fast over the past 40 years. Now, for Indian audience, so you may not feel proud about India's performance because you don't compare India with the US or Europe, because you think that India should have grown much faster than Europe or than US. So you are not happy because India's growth rate over the past 40 years, on average, has been only half of the Chinese level. So you are not that happy. Now, of course, then you want to ask why China has done much better than India in terms of economic growth. But I think this question probably is not the right question to ask. Okay, let me show you why. So to compare just India with China, it's not the right comparison. It's not the most appropriate comparison. Now, if you look at other developing countries, if you look at sub-Saharan Africa over the past 40 years, they have barely grown at all. So they started 40 years ago at a much higher income level than both India and China. But now they are still at the similar level. So these are basically low-income countries. Most of them are low-income countries. And then you look at some middle-income countries or lower middle-income countries like the Middle East and North African countries. Of course, we exclude all the oil-rich countries like Saudi Arabia or UAE. Now, Middle Eastern and North African countries have barely grown at all over the past 40 years. So they started at something more than $3,000. They are only at $4,000 today. Now, for some upper middle income economies, like most of the Latin American and the Caribbean economies. So of course, they have a much higher income level. They've had a much higher income level than both India and China. And they started at about $6,000, 2010 US dollars, 40 years ago. Now they are still less than $10,000 today. So their average growth rate over the past 40 years on a per capita basis has been less than 1%, which actually is significantly lower than that of the US or Europe or Japan. So US, Japan, and the European Union, you can see that their long-term per capita GDP growth rate has been basically about the same, exactly the same. Now, so this is very interesting. You can see that. So that means that developed countries are all alike, but less developed. So in a sense, rich countries are all alike. They are all rich. They grow at the same rate. But poor countries or developing countries are poor in their own ways. So different developing countries develop at very different rates. So the question is, why? So what determines the growth rate of developing countries? And of course, China. Of course, we are talking about the rapid rise of China. But then China basically, if you look at the per capita GDP, China is still only at the Latin American level. So China was the poorest country in the world 40 years ago. China was poorer than India. China was much poorer than Africa 40 years ago. Now, today, China is, we can call China the poorest, the richest poor country in the world. Okay, China is the richest poor country in the world because China is still a poor country in the sense because China still has an income level that is way below the developed economies. So China's income level is only 1/6 of the US level. So China's income level on average is only at the level of Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico, Latin American countries. So in that sense, China is still a relatively poor country. But then, of course, China is rich compared to most of the other developing countries. So then how do you explain the rapid rise or rapid economic growth of China over the past 40 years, and why China has been the fastest growing economist in the world? So I said that the comparison between, simple comparison between India and China is somewhat misleading, because if you take away China, I take away Korea, which is already a developed country. Basically, if you take away China, India is the fastest growing developing economy in the whole world. If you take away a few, of course, minor economies, so India has been growing very fast. So the reason, so basically, so not just so it's not that India has grown more slowly than China, because every other country has been growing more slowly than China. So India is, of course, is not the exception. But then the more interesting question, so the interesting question is not why India has done poorly in terms of growth in China, but the question is, the more interesting question, so how come India has been the second fastest growing the past 20, 30 years? So that would be a more interesting question. So of course, so my answer to the rapid rise of China should also be able to answer the question of why India has grown fast, or why Korea has grown fast. In a sense, both India and China and Korea have grown much faster than other developing countries. Remember, most developing countries have grown more slowly than developed countries. So that's what I call the Chinese growth puzzle. So the puzzle is not why China has grown faster than one particular country, or China has grown faster than the Western countries. The puzzle is why China has grown so much faster than other developing countries. That's the real puzzle. So of course there are a lot of explanations. Of course, reform in China, we credit China's performance in growth to reform and opening up policy. Of course, that's true. Without reform and opening up, China would probably still be a poor country. But that can only explain why China has been able to grow faster than, let's say, North Korea or Cuba. It doesn't help us to understand why China has grown faster than, let's say, the Philippines or Indonesia or Nigeria, right? So, in fact, if you actually look at the economic freedom index around the world, China doesn't rank high at all. China, according to these two indices, China actually ranks quite lowly, way below average. So not only China ranks low, India also ranks pretty lowly. So, but for whatever reason, both China and India have grown fast, much faster than all the other developing economies. So, so of course, that shows that China's strength is not that China is one of the freest economies in the world, or China has one of the more marketized economy in the world. So, so in a sense, so in spite of China still not being a very free economy, China has still grown very fast. Now, of course, this is another common myth, is that China has a strong government for whatever reason. So presumably because China has a unique political system. But then, of course, if you look at a global data, you do a global comparison. So here I use this scatter graph to show that basically political regime and economic growth have no necessary relationship. So here, so every dot is a country, represents a country. Only developing countries. I'm only looking at the developing countries only, because most developed countries are democratic, and their growth rate has been around 1.5 to 2% a year. So I only look at the developed countries for, let's say, for a 10-year period. So the horizontal axis is the so-called the democracy index. And the vertical axis is the average per capita GDP growth for the 10-year period between 2001 to 2010. So you don't see any relationship. So within democracies, there are good performers, relatively good performers, and poor performers. And within non-democracies, there are also good performers and bad performers. So there's no clear relationship. Of course, I use this democracy with a quotation mark, because this is done by Western scholars. So according to Western scholars, or Western standard, China, of course, is not a democracy. So we have a negative 7%, -7 measure on this democracy index. But then, of course, according to China's own standard, China is highly democratic. So we have this highly developed socialist economy, socialist democracy, only that Western scholars don't recognize it. So it doesn't really matter. So what I'm saying is that the Western democracy has no clear relationship with economic growth. Now, then of course, democracy index may be too crude a measure of politics. So if you look at some more specific measure of politics in terms of governance, let's say political stability or government effectiveness. So in fact, World Bank has actually started doing this, compiling data on these measures. They have started doing they started doing this in 1996. So I took their measures for the 20-year period from 1996 to 2016. So then I ranked them by the I rank all the countries by their index. Now you can see that to my surprise, I found that China only ranked 151st in terms of political stability, and India is even much lower. So then I realized that, well, it's not that China, it doesn't mean that China is not politically not stable, India is politically unstable. It simply means that at least during those 20-year period, so most countries in the world were politically stable. So China is no more stable than most other countries. China, of course, has had the political stability, but that's not the strength of China. That's not a strength. In a sense, China is not unique in this regard, because most countries, like the Philippines, are ranked at 194. So how unstable politically were they? Probably not that unstable anyway. So basically, that means that the whole world has enjoyed political stability. But most of the countries have enjoyed political stability over the past 20, 30 years. And then, of course, when you look at the government effectiveness, China, of course, and both China and India have done much better. And both countries are above average, world average. But still, that if you, like China ranks at 92, now, of course, we cannot take all these numbers too seriously, too literally, but still, it means that China doesn't have the most effective government, at least. Because economic management is not economic management is very subtle, it's very complex. It's not it doesn't depend on the total the raw strength of a government. It depends on skills and everything else. So China, of course, is above average, but that 92, if you are ranked 92, doesn't mean, of course, doesn't make you grow the fastest in the world. So in terms of government effectiveness, China ranks below Malaysia, okay, below Jamaica, below Mauritius. So in that sense, China doesn't have a very unique strength in terms of politics or government. Now, of course, some people say China has this mixed economy. So we have industrial policy, we have subsidies to SOEs. But then SOEs in China are known to be less efficient. So if you look at the returns on assets, you compare returns on assets of SOEs over the past 20-some years to all industrial enterprises, they are poor performers. If you look at the return on equity again, return on equities, again, they are poor performers. So basically, probably industrial policies or subsidies have basically made Chinese economy less efficient rather than more efficient. So we might say, in spite of poorly or in spite of the inefficient policies of subsidies to SOEs, China has managed to grow the fastest in the world. Now, of course, China has been able to take advantage of globalization But then again, that's not so unique to China. Globalization by definition is global. So every country can participate in globalization. And indeed, of course, if you look at the whole world, so the past 40 years has indeed been the age of globalization. So measured by exports as a percent of GDP, exports to GDP ratio. So for the whole world, this ratio has basically doubled. It has doubled for the EU. And what about China? So China started from a very low level at 5% and went up to almost 35% before the global financial crisis. Now it's down to about 18%. Now, of course, China has enjoyed the benefit of globalization, but then other countries have also enjoyed the benefit of globalization. So India has basically at the same level growth in terms of exports, in the sense of exports to GDP ratio. India was at the similar level 40 years ago as China. Now it's also at 18% a year. And then you look at Turkey, another major developing economies. Turkey was, in a sense, a closed economy 40 years ago. They started at even lower level, less than 5%. Now they are at more than 30%. And then you look at Mexico, which started 10%. So Mexico was already a more open economy 40 years ago. Now Mexico is even more open. Their exports to GDP ratio now is at 40%. So Mexico is a member of the North America Free Trade Organization. But obviously Mexico has enjoyed this, has been riding on the wave of globalization. But then Mexico's per capita GDP growth rate has been lower than the US, has been about only 1% a year. So their GDP growth at about 2.3% a year on average over the past 40 years, still lower than the US. So Mexico is a poorer economy and it's an open economy, but it has a lower growth rate than the American economy, not to mention the Chinese economy or the Indian economy. So that means globalization, of course, has been good for the world economy in general, but it doesn't mean that once you open up, economy will automatically grow faster than before. That's not the case. Now, if you look at FDI, foreign direct investment, of course, China is now, of course, the biggest, the country that has attracted the most foreign direct investment among all the developing countries. China has been the country that has attracted the most foreign direct investment. But then, if you use the FDI to GDP ratio, so then China is not so unique at all. So China FDI, foreign direct investment as percent of GDP has been quite average for China, ordinary, 3% a year over a 30-year period, which ranks China at the 70th place. So India has an even lower FDI to GDP ratio, way lower than most other developing countries, but still India has managed faster growth than other developing countries. So of course, some people, especially some people in the U.S. government or in the Trump administration, believe that the theft of intellectual property rights is the secret behind China's technological progress. Well, of course, China is not a model for intellectual property rights protection. Of course, China could have done better, but then almost all developing countries are not models for intellectual property rights protection. If we actually use the IP payments to foreigners over the past 20 years as a measure, so China actually has China's protection IP probably is no worse than any other developing countries. So the annual growth of IP payments to foreigners from China has been increasing at 20.7% a year over the past 20 years. And India also has the second fastest growth in IT payments to foreigners. So in that sense, so the reason why Nigeria or the Philippines or Indonesia have not grown faster, or Mexico have grown faster than America, it's not because they are too strict in IP protection. That cannot be the reason. Now, of course, both China and India have abundant cheap labor. So some people call this a demographic dividend. But then, of course, there's no relationship between population and economic growth. So if you look at this scattered chart, so every dot is country. So China, of course, is here, has the largest population, about 1 billion people back in 1979. Now, this is India, has about 900 million people. But you don't see any relationship between population and economic growth. So big countries have, big countries grow faster than others, and big countries can also have slow growth. Small countries can also have fast growth, but small countries can also have slower growth. So basically, you don't really see any relationship. Now, so the question, of course, is then what has really driven the rapid rise of China? So this is the puzzle I try to address in my book. Now, in order to address that question, so we have to really go back to the basic economics, the basic macroeconomics, which distinguishes between economic growth and economic fluctuation. So economic growth really is normally defined as a sustained rise in the capacity to supply economic goods and services. So by definition, it's a long-term concept. But economic fluctuation means short-term variation in growth rates. Now, once you make that distinction, then basically almost automatically, so the determinants of long-term economic growth are these three factors. So investment, which means the accumulation of physical capital; education, that is the accumulation of human capital; and then technological progress, that's the accumulation of technologies. So the commonly mentioned drivers of economic growth, like consumption, investment, exports, these are not drivers of long-term growth. They are the causes of economic fluctuation. So consumption and exports themselves do not make a country grow fast. So if consumption can make a country grow fast, then of course there will be no poor country. So every country just tries to consume more, which of course is not just possible unless of course you have the capacity to produce. So that means, so we want to look at the determinants of long-term economic growth in the Chinese context. So I look at the three drivers of economic growth: investment, education, and the technological progress. First, let's look at the investment. So this table shows you that China has, over the past 40 years, China has had the highest investment to GDP ratio. So that means China invests more in physical capital than every other country. Now, so all these relatively fast-growing economies like China, Korea, and Singapore and India have a higher investment rate. Now, of course, the question is, so if investment makes a country grow faster, then why not all countries try just invest more? So, of course, in order to invest, then you have to have money. So the investment has to be financed. So, of course, China has been able to finance its investment through gross domestic savings. So China has one of the highest savings rate in the world. So the difference between savings and the investment is called net export, which is also called the trade surplus. So China, on average, has invested less than China has saved. So we have trade surplus, but India in general has invested more than India has saved. So India has a trade deficit. The same is true with the US. But Singapore has probably one of the highest ratio of trade surplus, because Singapore has the highest savings rate in the world, but their investment rate is not as high. So they have a trade surplus of about 16% of their GDP a year. Now, of course, then so why do some countries save more, some save less? Of course, it all boils down to consumption rate. So China has one of the lowest consumption rate in the world, and Singapore, of course, has the lowest consumption rate. So in a sense, so this actually shows a unique feature of the Chinese economy. That is, China has one of the highest investment rate in the world, which of course is made possible by the fact that China has one of the highest savings rate in the world. So for India to have to invest as much as China, India has to increase its savings rate by 10%, another at least 10 percentage points. So this is not as easy as it seems, because most countries save 25% or even less. Now, the second driver of economic growth is education, but it's not the quantitative education. If you use the measures of quantitative education, so China is not unique. China has no strength in this area. So whether you measure it by the public expenditure on education, public expenditure on education as percent of GDP. So China actually is very average. So many developing countries invest more in education, like Botswana, like South Africa, even Brazil, in Ghana. So they all invest more of their public money on education than China. Now, and also you look at the average years of schooling, which of course is generally the result of public education. So China again is very average. China's average years of schooling is basically lower than many developing countries. Of course, if you compare India with China, of course, India has done more, has done worse than China. But then look at these numbers. So India, among developing countries, India's education is one of the poorest in terms of quantity. But then still, India has managed the world's second fastest economic growth. So that means probably the quantitative education doesn't have much relationship with economic growth. That's exactly what some scholars have tried to argue. So a well-known Stanford economist, Eric Hanushek, together with his students, compiled a set of data that tries to measure the quality of education. So they call it the cognitive skills index. So they compile a data set of about 78 countries, and they show that East Asian economies have the highest cognitive skills index, and yeah, even higher than some of the European countries. And then where do they get these indices? Basically, what they use is that they really just look at the test scores. So one well-known test is the so-called PISA test. So if you look at the PISA test organized by the OECD Commission, so you can see there's a high correlation between the cognitive skills index and the PISA test scores, like in math or in science. So all East Asian economies have done well, and India has not participated in the PISA test, so we don't have any scores for India. But then Hanushek and his students have assembled a data point for India as well. So you can see that China's cognitive skills index is about 4.9, and India's 4.3, 4.28. So China is higher than India, but India is higher than almost all other developing economies. So can this index explain economic growth? So Hanushek and his students actually show that the relationship between economic growth and the quality of education as measured by test scores is highly correlated. So after you control for some common factors like income level or quantitative education, so the relationship between quality of school and education and growth is very strong. And for every 1 point difference in the education in the cognitive skills index score, so for every 1 point difference, so the impact on growth is 2 percentage points every year. So for example, China's index is about 5. So Peru and South Africa have an index about 3. So on this factor alone, China can potentially grow 4 percentage points faster than those two countries. So basically, this table seems to explain a lot of stuff. It can explain why China has been the fastest growing economy in the world over the past 40 years. It can also explain why Japan is the first non-Western country to successfully industrialize. And it can also explain why the 4 Asian tigers were the fastest growing economies between the 1950s and 1990s. And it can also explain why India is the second fastest growing economy. India and Vietnam are probably the second fastest growing economies after China over the past 20 to 30 years. Now, now we come to the third driver of economic growth, technological progress. So one measure of technological progress, of course, is the patent the growth of patent applications. So for a developing country, of course, you don't really have a lot of patents. Because the first thing for a developing country to do is to try to absorb existing Western technologies. So that's why developing countries don't have a lot of patent applications. So patents are normally applied by companies in developed countries like the US and Japan. So companies in Brazil and Mexico, these upper middle income economies don't have a lot of patents. And the companies in Nigeria, in African, the more developed African economy has only a few hundred patent applications a year. So you don't expect developing economies to have a lot of patent applications. But then China is somewhat the exception. China started to have a patent system in the mid of 1980s. Now, China has the largest number of patent applications in the whole world. China has more than 1 million patent applications. We are talking about the inventions, more than every other country. And the growth rate of patent applications is also very fast. Then, of course, you look at Korea. Korea also has enjoyed a very fast growth in patent applications. And then India, the same thing. India also has enjoyed a very fast growth in patent applications. So in my book, I try to advocate a perspective a perspective analysis, which I call a global comparative perspective. So to compare China with any single country is not very useful, or it's misleading. Or to compare India with China also is misleading. You have to take a global comparative perspective, and you have to adopt also a long-term perspective. So by looking at this, for example, when we look at this picture, so if you just compare India with China, so you will think that, oh, India is just doing so poorly. India is such a big country, and India's patent application is only like 30-some thousand patent applications a year. China has more than 1 million. But then less than 20 years ago, China had the same number of patent applications as India has today. So that means if in the next 15 to 20 years, India has this, if India's economy has this, if India economy can enjoy the similar growth rate in the next 20 years as China's over the past 20 years, then 20 years from now, India's patent applications will be just as large as China today. So in that sense, so if you look at look at this from a more dynamic perspective, so you can see that if India follows this growth path, so India's technological innovation level will be just as good as China today, or 20 years from as China 20 years from now, India will basically catch up to China today's level of China's patent applications. So then you look at the other basic scientific research output, like scientific articles in those basically English core scientific journals. So again, you see the patents. That is the US, Europe, and Japan have the largest number of scientific articles published. And then, of course, other places have much lower level of publications. But then India, then you look at India, has seen a tremendous growth over the past 20 years. And then China, of course, has the faster growth in terms of scientific publications. Now China has the largest number of scientific publications in English journals than the whole of European Union. So that's a very fast growth. So basically, so to summarize what I've just presented, so I think China's rapid rise in the past 4 decades has been basically contributed by a faster accumulation of physical capital, that is investment, due to higher savings than all other developing countries. And secondly, a relatively higher quality of education, basic education especially, has made China more capable. So we are talking about quality, not quantity. So a higher quality of education has made China more capable in absorbing existing Western technologies and developing indigenous innovation capacity, leading to faster technological catch-up. Now, of course, then the conclusion in my book I enjoy is that so China's comparative strength is more cultural than institutional or tactical. So that is the differentiating factor that distinguishes China from other developing countries is not the institutions or policy differences, but more cultural in the sense that so China, so the Confucian culture of savings and education probably has made the difference. It has made China, so basically it's the Confucian culture of savings and education that made China have the highest savings rate in the whole world, only after Singapore, which again is a Confucian economy. And so this Confucian culture of education is also responsible for China's high quality of basic schooling, not the quantity. Because the quantity depends on government policy, but the quality of education depends on the parents, which of course is related to the cultural emphasis on education. So compared to, of course, other developing countries, India also has this, of course, this tradition of has also enjoyed this traditional emphasis on education. So compared to other developing countries, so in that sense, so this can explain why. So this cultural perspective not only can explain why China has grown faster than other developing countries. It can also explain why India has grown faster than other developing countries, except for China. It can also explain why Korea has been one of the fastest growing economies in the world over the past 40 years. So now I would wrap up with some forecast on the future of the Chinese economy. So people, of course, are worried in China, also globally, people are worried that maybe US-China relations will put a dent on the Chinese growth. But then basically, it is almost impossible for the US and China to decouple, because in US-China are very much interdependent. If you look at US goods imports from China as a percent of US goods imports in total, so that's went from less than 10% a year 20 years ago to more than 20% now. After the trade war, now it's down to about 17-18%, but it's stabilized at 17 to 18%. And for China, China's goods exports to US as a percentage point of China's goods, total exports of goods, is also about 17%. So basically, China. China is, we can see the US is China's biggest customer, and China is America's biggest supplier. So it is almost unthinkable for the two countries to really decouple from each other. And then if we look at the China's goods exports to the US as a percent of China's GDP, that is actually not very high as people might perceive. So the China's total goods exports to the US is only about 3% of China's GDP. So in other words, even if US imposes a 25% penalty tariff on all Chinese exports, so that only accounts basically accounts for 0.75% of China's total GDP. And this burden will, in general, be shared by both the US customers and China exporters. So the total burden on the Chinese economy basically is 0.4% of GDP. So that's why this US trade war has not really made a big difference on both China's growth and also both China's exports and imports sectors. So of course, again, the goods imports from the US as a percentage of GDP, China's GDP also is very low. So in that sense, so if the US-China trade wars stops at the tariff level, so the impact is quite minimal. Okay, of course, the impact will be much greater if actually US and China stop to trade with each other, but which of course is bad for both parties. So which is unlikely to happen. So basically, my conclusion in the book is that China's economic growth may be slowed down a bit by some conceivable post-COVID adverse factors, but unless China significantly reverses market reforms, its further rise seems irreversible. So I predict that China can potentially grow at 6% a year over the next 10 years, and the US grows at 2%. So if that's the case, then 10 years from now, China will be the biggest economy in the world, will surpass the US. And then after that, Chinese growth will slow down, but the average growth over the average growth rate, annual growth rate over the next 30 years for China can still reach 5%. And if that's the case, then Chinese economy will be 1.6 times of the US level, so in 30 years. But even then, on the per capita basis, China's per capita GDP will still be less than 50% of the US level, even 30 years from now. So of course, that means even 30 years from now, there is still some room for China to catch up with the US. Now, of course, whether China can catch up with the US in terms of per capita GDP, of course, it's hard to know whether that's going to happen at all in this century. So even if it happens, it's going to be a long time from now. So we don't worry about it. Now, so of course, China will be the biggest economy in the world, but then China will never be so powerful as to dominate the world. Basically, no country will dominate the world because the world is going to be a truly multipolar place. So if you look at the GDP in current US dollars, of course, the US is still the biggest economy, and the EU and China are about the same, and then Japan, India, and Russia. Now, of course, Russia is not the sixth largest economy. I should list Russia here because Russia is militarily very powerful. Now, if you look at the GDP on a purchasing power parity basis, so China already has the biggest economy in the world, and then US and Europe, and India then is the fourth largest economy in the world. And then if we envision a future like 30, 50 years from now, when both China and India become a developed economy, then hopefully, then basically China will be the biggest, China may be the biggest economy in the world, India will be the second largest economy, and the European Union and the United States. So basically, so the future is not just China versus the US. So European Union will play an active role, an important role, and India will also play a very important role in the world. So in that sense, so we are entering a truly multipolar world. So it will be more productive for other countries to try to benefit from the rise of China and also India, so not to prevent it. But on the other hand, of course, China needs to do its part to make the rise of China benefit other countries instead of hurting the interests of the rest of the world. So if that's the case, then of course, I think the future for both China and the world and America and India and all other places will still be very bright. So the best days for China and the world are still ahead of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Zhu Tian, for that excellent presentation, very data-driven, and very insightful. If you could please stop sharing your screen, then I will invite Vamsi to share his thoughts on your presentation.
Yeah, okay.
And just to quickly summarize, you identified 3 factors: investment or the accumulation of physical capital, but that very interestingly is heavily predicated by the savings rate. Okay, and there is a limit to how much a country can invest, and I think for other developing countries to invest at the same level as China or other East Asian economies, that's going to be very, very difficult. The second and third factors, I think, the second factor, at least human capital, I think other countries can aspire to replicate China's success. The third factor, technological progress, again, is I think China has dedicated huge resources to the development of its technological capabilities. We just heard yesterday that in 2021, China spent $441 billion, 20% more than in 2020 in R&D. So these are very tremendous commitment of resources. One thought that perhaps Vamsi could address in his critique, and maybe you could pick up later in the Q&A, Zhu Tian, is also to what extent are these 3 factors mutually reinforcing? Okay, so that's a question I have. But without further ado, let me invite Vamsi to join us. So Vamsi, we look forward to your thoughts on Zhu Tian's presentation.
Thanks very much, Professor Velamuri. And I also want to thank Ahan and Mahak for inviting me from Asia Century Foundation. And thanks, Professor Zhu Tian, for a very interesting presentation. So to begin with, let me express my appreciation for Professor Zhu Tian's presentation. I think the presentation was extremely lucid. The argument was very, very clear. And I think there was a clear identification of important differences like savings or technological progress or educational quality, that underpin the rise of China. And I think, those are excellent. But my job is to criticize today, not to just appreciate. So let me present a range of criticisms. The first, I have 2 broad criticisms, and then I'll go into specificities. The first criticism is, when you talk about something like catching up, it's a long, drawn-out process, right? It took more than 70 years for China to overcome its negative growth and catch up with America, right? So it's a long, drawn-out process. And there are multiple underlying factors, that we'll have to analyze, in order to understand how that catching up process happened. So, if you go back to the 15th century, China and India were at the, core of the world economy, global economy. This is now well known. They produce 60% of world's output. And it took 400 years for Europe to catch up with China. And with China and India, largely Asian economies. And there was a lot of, there were internal processes in Asia, like, after 1700 or so, Asian economies begin to decline. Of course, China begins to decline only in the early 19th century. And there are a lot of external processes, like, the finding of American silver, which then fuels, an expansionary phase. So there are multiple internal and external processes that we have to look at. My sense is, there's a greater focus on outcomes, in Professor Zhu Tian's presentation, rather than the entire process. So I'll make some observations regarding the process. The second broad criticism is I'm very, unsure about culturalist explanations, because as opposed to institutionalist or political economy based explanations, for the longest time, the backwardness of Asia since 19th century and until about 1950s was also using culturalist explanations, right? They don't have the Protestant work ethic. They are lazy. Asians don't have the same kind of hardworking capabilities. So when you use something like culture, it becomes too easy. You can explain decline. You can also explain expansion. So I think, we should, I'm not discounting culture, but I think we should have a more composite explanation, which includes institutionalism, political economy, and culture. Culture also plays a role, but, I would not put it at the center. So having said that, let me make a few specific criticisms. I think several of the indexes that Professor Zhu Tian used, in order to criticize earlier explanations are somewhat vaguely defined, and they're mostly applicable to Western societies. China has a slightly different society. Some of the indexes that are probably useful to understand Western societies are not extremely useful to understand China. Let me give you some examples. So, for instance, something like political stability, it's completely counterintuitive to think that China does not have political stability. I think China has one of the most politically stable regimes. But what is the problem? If you go and look at World Bank's definition of the two indexes that Professor Zhu Tian used, one definition is government destabilization through violent means, right? So if you look at something like that, and then apply it indiscriminately to a country like China, then I don't even know how this violent means is being quantified and an index is being arrived at. Similarly, in terms of government effectiveness, what the index is measuring is independent from political pressures. That's impossible in China, right? I mean, it's a party state, right? And so when you apply that index, of course, China would rank very low. But China has incredible political stability. So I'm a little skeptical. Similarly, if you take something like foreign direct investment and exports, China's story, if you compare it globally, is not spectacular. But that is not the point, because what you have to look at is the institutional underpinnings. So, for instance, in 1979, right after the opening up of China sets up these special economic zones, and then in the special economic zones there's a unique combination of foreign capital and the incredibly industrious migrant workers, right? So you create a whole. Shenzhen had 300,000 people in 1979. Now it's a 25 million people city. How does that emerge? It comes out of the special economic zone, which brings in foreign capital and migrant workers. So so FDI, in quantitative terms may not be important, but in strategic terms, it played a very key role. I think institutionally, strategically, I think it played a very important role. Similarly, if you take broad population measures, you would not see any correlation between growth and population. But if you look at what happened institutionally in China, there was a lot of, more than 250 million migrant workers, who were fairly well educated and highly skilled. They migrated to urban areas, and then, they performed huge amounts of labor. So again, you can't take a broad measure like population. You will have to break it down. So, and in your explanation, if you take something like savings, I would want to look at the underlying sources of savings. So if you look at early 80s period, it was agriculture, which produced a lot of surplus. If you look at, the period of 1980s and early 90s, it's the township and village enterprises. If you look at the post-92, 93 period, it's a manufacturing sector itself that produced a lot of surplus. So where are the savings coming from? I think that's a key question. So just to sort of, I'll make three more comments and stop. An alternative and a competing explanation to the culturalist explanation that Professor Zhu Tian offered is, we need to look at the institutions and political economy of the last almost 75 years. So if you look at the Mao period, for instance, that, nobody talks about, 1949 to 1978 roughly, or 1976 when Mao dies. If you look at that period, there are three, super achievements of China. The first is, of course, the great reversal. China was growing negatively until 1949, and that is reversed by the Mao regime, right? So between 1850 and 1950, China had negative growth, and post 1950, China has a positive growth. That's a very important reversal. That also happens in India, by the way, after the British leave. But the second major achievement is elementary education. China had a literacy rate of around 20% in 1949. By the time, Mao era comes to an end, the literacy rate is close to 85%. It's a huge achievement during that period. And secondly, a lot of infrastructure was built by village communes and also in the industrial sector by state-owned enterprises. That infrastructure, if it was not built during that period, so for instance, irrigation, which then becomes very important for the agricultural growth in the early 80s. And then, the township and village enterprises that were built during that period and which begin to expand through the 80s and early 90s. And thirdly, I think Mao created a level playing field, through land reforms, through collectivization. He created a level playing field where, intelligence can come from anywhere. It's not just the wealthy and rich, that are intelligent or hardworking. But once you create a level playing field, the enterprise, the entrepreneurship that is unleashed through the 1980s, when market reforms are introduced, is much more broad-based. I think, these are three achievements during the Mao period. If you come to the institutions that were created after reforms, then, in agriculture, superior inputs were used in the 80s and, early 80s, which contributes to huge growth. But, the main policy plank of the reforms is gradualism. If you look at something like Soviet Union, they went for drastic reforms. This shock doctrine, you shock the old economy by subjecting it to markets. China never did that. It went through a very gradual phase. And I think that was key to, going slowly and checking whether, they'll succeed. And then they would come back and, implement other reforms once initial success is achieved. Similarly, special economic zones. The 3-4 large special economic zones, that's a crucial institutional variable that is introduced, through the late 70s and early 80s. And the two other points I'll make, and then, I'll be done. One is, China dipped into a deep Asian story of labor-intensive industrialization. Labor-intensive manufacturing, which was the strength of China. There was all these surplus labor reserves, hundreds of millions of labor reserves, and they had to utilize their strength. And it was labor-intensive industrialization, much more than the higher quality education, etc. That becomes an important factor later on. And then, there are two very different regimes. 1980s is relatively equal. It is demand generating and rising exports through township and village enterprises through the 1980s. And, utilizing, incorporating cheap labor power, right? So that is the 80s regime. But when you come to 90s, you see rising inequality. You see faster growth in exports. You see cheap rural labor power still being incorporated, rural to urban migration. But, there are problems with domestic demand. So there's a greater reliance on exports. If you look at the slide that you presented, exports begin to rise quite a lot, during that period. I think, China taps into the global demand. And then, you begin to see the decline in Chinese growth coincides with the decline in the global economy post 2008 crisis. And growth rates begin to taper off. So the broad point, so these are the specific criticisms I wanted to make. But the broad point I want to leave you with is, while Professor Zhu Tian's story captures one level of changes, and as he said, the culturalist level, where, the savings behavior of Chinese, or education or technological progress, patent applications, there are deeper underlying institutional and political economy stories that we need to dip into to really understand the catch-up. And it's over the last 75 years that we have to analyze, not merely after economic reforms. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vamsi, for that insightful critique. Let me give Zhu Tian maybe 5 minutes. Zhu Tian, would you like to come back and respond to what Vamsi has said? Zhu Tian, okay. I think you're muted.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Vamsi. Very insightful comments. Basically, it's very fair. I want to say very fair comments, and very knowledgeable. Obviously, you know just a lot about China, so it's a great discussion. But still, of course, I want to respond to your comments. Some of the stuff, of course, is in my book. My book, of course, I didn't have time to elaborate the cultural explanation, because basically I only used one sentence. But in the book, I have a whole chapter to respond to some of the critics you just mentioned. So of course that's it's fair. Indeed, of course, in the past people used culturalist explanation to explain why China and India have been backward, or whatever. So of course it can be a lazy cultural theory. So I want to go beyond this lazy cultural theory. We want to do the quantitative study. You really compare global data to pinpoint the role of culture. And of course, the culture is only one factor. That's totally true. So what I try to say is that, of course, institutions, everything are important, and there are thousands of necessary conditions for a rapid growth. But then I want to say that the differentiation. So what the difference maker, I think, on the first order, is the culture of savings in the education. That's what I try to argue. But of course, this again is still a strong argument, but it's not as strong as it looks. So it's not just like totally a cultural view. Of course, institutions always are very important. Without institutional reforms, without what you just all mentioned, those factors, of course, China cannot grow. Without globalization, China's growth will be much lower. But then those are not really so unique to China. A lot of stuff is real, and of course, then you talk about the indicators. Again, I think that's a very fair point, because a lot of indicators just don't make a lot of sense. Right? How do you measure political stability? How do you measure? But then all those people who try to measure these, of course, try to make it universal, try to believe that these are, of course, applicable to every country. And then, of course, so that's why we cannot take these measures too literally or too seriously. But still, I think at the broad point, I still think it is still true that so China, of course, is very politically stable, but I still think that political stability is not the key strength of the Chinese economy, because a lot of countries are stable. So India is not really much more stable than the Philippines, but India still grows faster, right? So in a sense, so I'm trying to say that there's a political stability. So people have given too much credit to those the factors that I try to criticize. It's not that I don't think those things are unimportant, but they are given too much credit. But culture has been given too little credit because of the past lazy cultural approach. Yeah. So I totally agree with you that all those all the quantitative measures are not so good. They are not very good, to be honest. But this is what we have. But still, the general picture, I think, is true. But then as to so you talk about the Mao's period. So this is what we call the initial conditions argument. Of course, I also have I touch upon that in the book. I think, of course, the initial conditions always are important, especially in terms of education. It is true that my book actually showed that in 1980. So that the average years of schooling for China was significantly higher than almost all other developing countries. So China enjoyed a huge advantage in 1980. And then I show that, but this advantage completely disappeared in year 2000. So then how do you explain the post-2000 growth? So in that sense, so I'm not saying that the quantity is not completely, so this advantage didn't exist, but it's not, probably it's not the key, because I cited the literature that showed that the quantity of education is not really correlated with the globally correlated with the country's development speed, because some authors have indeed shown that a lot of African countries have enjoyed a fast increase in their education level. Also, it was also true in some Latin American countries, but then their growth has not picked up. So India, of course, is a counterexample. Is in a sense, India, in terms of average years of schooling, India actually is below a lot of African countries. But India has a very fast growth. So I think the general point, I still believe that the general point that the quality of basic education is one of the most important key factors for economic development. So all the rest probably it can come, in a sense, can be built up, because you need people to build up institutions, you need people to do a lot of stuff. And in both China and India have this traditional emphasis on education. So that's why, so our quality of education basically is up to the parents, in a sense. So, but you look at in the US, all the Asian kids, like Indian kids with children with Chinese or Indian heritage, they do well in schools. It's not because they are smarter. It's just that they barely education more, or they have this cultural pressure to do well in school. So I cited a lot of stuff in the book. So basically, I totally agree with you that I mean that the points, almost all the points you made are all fair points, And I want, because if, I want to say that in my book I sound a lot more sophisticated than what I was given time for it in the speech. But but I still so my conclusion is that I still stick to my general point, which is that it's the cultural emphasis on education and the savings that is the differentiating factor behind China's growth. And because the reason so we cannot just use all the specific Chinese stories to explain China's growth, because then how do you explain Korea's growth? How do you explain Taiwan's growth? How do you explain Singapore's growth, or India's growth, or now Vietnam's growth? Right, because all countries do things differently. So all the 4 Asian tigers have different political models, different economic models, but they have all done well, right? So in a sense, I try to find something that is more common among these big miracle achievers. Yeah. So, but I take your point. I mean, in the book, I try to show that. Yeah, I try to show maybe institutional factors should be taken into account. But then I say that the institutional factors probably also are related to somewhat to culture, like trust, like some Confucian culture, like benevolent government. In a sense, actually, I show that the Chinese government may not be like so clean, but Chinese government, in terms of corruption index, transparency index international, China's government, the degree of corruption is among the lowest among all developing countries. But of course, it's much poorer than all the developed countries. So in that sense, so I believe that policies probably matter. Maybe Chinese policy, the quality of Chinese policies is somewhat better than in some other countries. But then you still have to explain why somehow China has been able, or Taiwan, Korea have been able to adopt all these some good policies. Why not other countries? So probably that also has something to do with the human capital of government officials or the design of the policies. But anyway, but thank you very much for your comments, and very fair comments. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you, Zhu Tian, for the comments. I have maybe I'm going to ask you to share your thoughts. First, I'll ask Zhu Tian, and then I'll ask Vamsi. Please share your thoughts on what, from the outside, seems like a reversal of market reforms, especially, I think, starting with the cancellation of the Ant Financial's IPO in Hong Kong, and then the crackdown on the tech sector. It looks to outsiders that there is definitely a rollback of the market reforms. What are your thoughts on this, and how do you think it might affect China's future economic development?
Yeah, this is somewhat a sensitive question. From the appearance, so from the outside, there seems to be a reversal of reform. But then if you look at the rhetorics and even some policies, so China tries to deepen or even broaden its reform. China tries to open up even more. There are some policies like a free trade zone stuff, or try to open up the financial sector. So there has been policies that somehow move towards more open and more marketization direction. But there are also some policies that seem to move in the opposite direction. So I think it's a mixture of things. So it's really hard to say whether there is a reversal or not. Probably from the rhetorics, there may not be any reversal, but in effect or in perception, there seems to be some kind of reversal. If that's what people perceive, then whatever you do, then that's the perception is very important for business climate. So in the sense, so there is some truth to it, but I cannot say it's completely true. So I think it's a mixture of.
We have to wait and see, perhaps, right? Vamsi, what are your thoughts?
We have to wait and see. Yeah. What?
So very quickly, Professor Velamuri, I think for the longest time since 1980s, the Chinese state derived legitimacy from fast economic growth. And whenever growth slowdown happened, there was a recourse to nationalism. Chinese nationalism. I think it's the combination of growth and nationalism is what kept the Chinese regime very stable. And after 2008-9, as the growth process began to slow down, it created a legitimacy question. And what do you do with a large country that is still houses a lot of poor people, and inequalities have risen tremendously in the between 1992 and 2012. So when the new regime comes into being under Xi Jinping and after 2012, my take is that the growth slowdown was perceived to be politically unstable, right? So then that there had to be a response. So part of the response has been strengthening welfare systems, trying to reduce inequality. Part of the response has been trying to strengthen ideology. And in that process, somewhere, the criticisms that were made against market reforms had to be incorporated into the overall ideological process. I think that is what China is trying to figure out. I agree with Professor Zhu Tian that it's not a slam dunk case of reversal of market reforms. It's not that clear whether market reforms have been withdrawn. In some areas, they've actually advanced. There's no question about it. But overall, I think it's that desire for political stability and also desire for the parties hold on society, which they're somewhat afraid of losing, right? So that would be my broad response.
And also, I think the problem of inequality was a very real problem, and I think the regime had to deal with it in some way, right? Sooner or later, that had to be dealt with, and I think we are seeing with this harmony, right? It's what's the harmonious development.
That is during Hu Jintao's time, but yes, I think some of those
common prosperity,
society, common prosperity, prosperity
is I think is very much response to that. Let me see if there is any question here in the chat box. Let's see. I think we'll have just one or two, maybe. So there's one question here which says, in Chinese manufacturing sector, how has the adoption of automation and robotic technologies contributed to value creation and growth? Zhu Tian, very quickly, do you want to just take that?
I don't have data for that. I don't know if there is a solid study on this. I mean, this is a quantitative issue. It's hard to say. But then it is true that because Chinese labor cost has increased a lot. And so when I visit factories, it's really the degree of automation is amazing. Yeah.
Yes. And I think McKinsey had a report that was saying that at least 2018 or 2017, about 25% of the global demand for industrial robots was coming from China, right?
Yes, exactly. And also, of course, and also because of this fertility, because of this population demographics, the Chinese age structure is getting older, and then it's harder to get younger workers than before. So maybe this is not this is not going to be drag. This probably is a positive factor in the case of Chinese economic growth. Yes.
And there's a very interesting observation, which I think both of you will agree with. It's Francisco says, I see reversal not only in terms of the tech crackdown, but also on the softer aspects as limiting the wealth show-off of celebrities and TikTokers and guidelines for TV shows on the type of content and the constant mention of common prosperity and so on. So this is also a kind of an attempt by I think the regime to make China a more equitable society. Correct? Yeah. So please, Zhu Tian, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's quite good observation. I mean, but it's how it's but still we don't know yet. I mean, it's hard to say. Of course, it's sensitive. I cannot say it very explicitly, but generally, we have to wait and see. Basically,
right.
We still have to wait and see. In some of it probably is. I would say some of this is some of it may be a more populist measure. You know what I mean? So they have sometimes some of the measures have strong popular support.
In fact,
at least online, you know what I mean. So it's not the so of course it's not the socialist or communist or whatever. It's sometimes it can be populist. But anyway, of course these are the things that people we have been talking about. So we hope it's not there will not be a reversal. Of course, even in the West, people talk about how do you control social media, because social media can get out of hand, right? So but then how do you strike a good balance? And that's in terms of government effectiveness. China's government is not very subtle. It's not very. Some of the measures are too blunt. So of course, a blunt measure has bad consequences. So that's why China. I wouldn't rank Chinese government effectiveness as top of the world. So in that sense, there may be some reversal. So in that sense, but we don't know whether that's going to be a trend or how long it's going to last. We don't know yet. Yeah. Or at least what's the economic consequence? The economic consequence may not be short term. Of course, there is some economic consequence, but may not be a big deal.
Vamsi, please go ahead.
Yeah, just very quickly, during my many visits to China between 2005 and 2015, roughly, one thing that I noticed is there was growing unrest and growing militancy among the millions of migrant workers. And they were actively resorting to a Maoist kind of language. They would listen to, they would actually go back to Mao because, Mao was the true radical, true revolutionary. So when they were in trouble, they started going back to Mao. I think a lot of these responses, partly they're real, trying to improve the safety net. It starts with Hu Jintao and continues with Xi Jinping. So this is a real improvement in terms of the safety net. So you also try to incorporate migrants. You try to give them more protections and so on. But on the other hand, there is also, as Professor Zhu Tian mentioned, there's also the optics of it. How do you want the regime to appear? Is it only catering to the business people, to the capitalist class, or is this regime answerable and accountable to the larger population? I think it's that balance that, again, the legitimacy question, because there is no active democracy, but you have to win the optics game constantly. How do you do that, right? So I think it's a combination of the two.
I think it's also probably fair to say that at least until 2021, China did not allow politics to trump economics. One of the criticisms about India and its economic trajectory is that in India, politics usually trumps economics. But I think starting from 2021, we are beginning to see that politics also is equally important for China, right? And at least in some areas, you're beginning to see politics trump economics in China also, right?
That is true. Yeah, that is true. But then again, so of course, I try to take a very long-term perspective. So want to see the potential. Of course, I hope that China will not reverse the market reforms. China will become more open in all areas. But that's only my hope. I don't know what so of course you never know what the government is thinking, what the government is going to do. Of course, we have no control over that. But then, so if China doesn't reverse its market reforms, or doesn't close its door, or become more, in a sense, more closed, not only economic or ideologically, but if China keep open, then I think so the economic fundamentals are still there. So that's why I also have a very optimistic view about the Indian economy and the Vietnamese economy, because politics, of course, sometimes can trump economics. But then, as I often said to my students, so it's easy to kill someone. Like a doctor can easily kill a patient, but there's no doctor that can cure someone from a very severe disease. You know what I mean? So in a sense, politics can kill an economy. Definitely, like China, during the Cultural Revolution. So of course, politics can kill the economy. But then if you don't have good economic fundamentals, so no government can save you. Basically, that's not can save you. No government can make you grow. Can deliver a miracle growth. So we are talking about miracle level growth. That is a growth rate that is significantly faster than the developed country. That's why you catch up, right? But most developing countries are not catching up, not because of their, of course, we always see politics. Okay, every country has their own politics. But then why all most countries, some don't develop, they all have different politics. Why is that? So that's why I think economic fundamentals in the long run will trump politics, hopefully. Yeah.
If I can quickly jump in, I think there is a lot of fascinating political economy literature initiated by Alice Amsden and others, from MIT, who argued that careful state intervention has always been part of the East Asian growth story. So states have intervened. It's not just markets. I think it's careful state intervention. With controlled market expansion and growth into exports. I think that has been the key. I just wanted to
true. I know, Vamsi.
throw it out there.
In a sense, people seem to already know this a long time ago. Amsden wrote this book like 30 or 40 years ago. So we already knew this.
Yeah.
So if we already knew this, so how come other countries have not followed whatever the East Asian model, right? The model is so clear to some people.
No, in many cases, Professor Zhu Tian, in many cases, they were not allowed to. So IMF or World Bank with their conditionalities did not allow for,
I know, but at least there should be some countries that can do it. But the point is that almost no country has done it, other than the East Asian
countries. Yeah.
So what I mean, so that's the point. So it's not that of course, I think the government should play some role. I totally agree with that. But then, so the question is, how come all the East Asian governments have done it in a different way somehow?
Yes.
with different economic models. And then India has done it. I don't know whether India's government intervention is necessarily better than other countries. So
in
so
Indian case is somewhat different, Professor Zhu Tian. We didn't talk about it here.
I think we should dedicate a separate session.
Yeah, it's a very interesting discussion. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we've run out of time. This is one of the best sessions that I have participated in the last couple of years. And I think it's one of the best sessions because we had an outstanding speaker and an outstanding discussant. Okay, I think I really want to congratulate Zhu Tian and Vamsi for really outstanding interventions. I would invite all of you, all the participants, to please share a round of applause for Zhu Tian